Picture this. You're a farmer in the 14th century France. You've just finished harvesting your grain when you hear it, the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Your blood runs cold because you know what's coming. It's not thunder, it's death. Armed men are approaching your village, and whether they're on your side or the enemy's side matters very little. Your wife, your children, your entire way of life is about to be shattered in ways so horrific that modern minds can barely comprehend the brutality. What I'm about to tell you will forever change how you view medieval warfare. We're not talking about noble knights in shining armor engaging in honorable combat. We're talking about systematic campaigns of terror that turned entire populations into victims of unspeakable violence. The reality of medieval war was not fought on battlefields between armies. It was fought in burning villages, in ransacked homes, and in the broken bodies of innocent civilians who had the misfortune of existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. When we think of medieval warfare, Hollywood has conditioned us to imagine gallant knights charging across open fields, banners flying, honor intact. The reality was infinitely more sinister. Medieval war was not a gentleman's game. It was a systematic campaign of terror designed to break the enemy's will by destroying everything they held dear. The primary victims of medieval warfare weren't soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, mothers, children, and the elderly. These were people who had no say in the political machinations that brought armies to their doorsteps, yet they bore the full weight of warfare's brutality. The concept of civilian immunity was virtually non-existent in medieval military doctrine. The medieval military mindset operated on a simple principle: break the enemy's ability to resist by destroying their means of survival. This meant targeting not just military installations, but farms, mills, workshops, and homes. It meant terrorizing populations so thoroughly that they would beg their lords to surrender, rather than endure continued suffering. When medieval armies moved through enemy territory, they followed a systematic pattern of destruction that had been refined over centuries. This wasn't random violence, it was organized terror with specific objectives. The first phase involved reconnaissance. Advanced scouts would identify the most vulnerable targets: isolated farms, small villages, and monasteries. These locations were chosen not for their strategic military value, but for their psychological impact. The goal was to create a wave of terror that would spread faster than the army itself. The second phase was the actual assault. Medieval soldiers would surround a village or farmstead, cutting off all escape routes. What followed was a carefully orchestrated campaign of violence designed to extract maximum psychological impact. Buildings were not simply destroyed. They were burned in ways that would maximize suffering and create lasting trauma in survivors. The third phase was systematic looting. Medieval armies were essentially mobile economies that sustained themselves through plunder. Every valuable item was seized: grain stores, livestock, tools, clothing, and precious metals. But the looting went beyond material goods. Medieval soldiers understood that destroying a community's means of survival was more devastating than simply killing its members. The fourth phase was the most horrific: the systematic brutalization of the civilian population. This wasn't a byproduct of warfare, it was a deliberate tactic designed to break the enemy's morale and demonstrate the futility of resistance. One of the most disturbing aspects of medieval warfare was the systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Modern research has revealed that rape was a scene of mass atrocities, followed by enslavement of women, girls, and young boys in sexual slavery in numerous medieval conflicts. Sexual violence in medieval warfare served multiple strategic purposes. First, it was a method of psychological warfare designed to humiliate and demoralize enemy populations. Second, it was used as a tool of cultural destruction, permanently damaging the social fabric of enemy communities. Third, it served as a form of economic warfare, disrupting the enemy's ability to maintain population levels. Medieval armies developed specific protocols for sexual violence. Military codes strictly regulated pillaging and other acts that might be perpetrated on civilians without command, revealing that such violence was often officially sanctioned rather than being random acts of individual soldiers. The scale of sexual violence in medieval warfare was staggering. Chronicles describe entire communities where every woman of childbearing age was violated. Monasteries were specifically targeted because the rape of nuns was considered particularly devastating to enemy morale. The psychological impact extended far beyond immediate victims. Entire communities lived in terror of approaching armies, knowing that surrender offered no protection. Families would sometimes kill their own daughters rather than allow them to be captured. Medieval warfare was fundamentally an economic enterprise, and civilian populations were both the primary source of wealth and the primary target of economic destruction. Medieval armies were expensive to maintain, creating a system where armies were expected to sustain themselves through plunder. The economic logic of medieval warfare made civilian populations inevitable targets. The most efficient way to obtain resources was through systematic plunder of civilian settlements. This wasn't opportunistic looting. It was organized economic warfare. Medieval military leaders understood that destroying an enemy's economic base was more effective than defeating their armies. A lord whose peasants had been killed or displaced, whose crops had been burned, and whose infrastructure had been destroyed, could not raise new armies or continue resistance. Craftsmen were particularly valuable because they possessed skills that could be exploited. They were often captured and forced to work for their captors. Merchants were targeted because they possessed portable wealth and knowledge of trade routes. Religious institutions were prime targets because they often served as banks and storage facilities for community wealth. Medieval warfare deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure with a thoroughness that modern observers find shocking. This wasn't collateral damage. It was a primary strategic objective designed to ensure that enemy populations could not recover from military defeats. Mills were among the first targets in any medieval campaign. These structures were essential for processing grain into flour, and their destruction could doom entire communities to starvation. Medieval armies would destroy the millstones, ensuring that the facilities could not be quickly repaired. Bridges were systematically destroyed to prevent civilian populations from fleeing or receiving aid. Granaries and food storage facilities were targeted with particular brutality. Medieval armies would contaminate stored grain with human waste or poison it to ensure it could not be consumed by surviving civilians. Water sources were systematically poisoned or blocked. Wells were filled with corpses, streams were diverted, and irrigation systems were destroyed. These tactics were designed to make affected areas uninhabitable for extended periods. Roads and trade routes were deliberately damaged to prevent economic recovery. Medieval military strategists understood that psychological terror was often more effective than physical violence in achieving strategic objectives. The systematic terrorization of civilian populations was a carefully crafted psychological warfare campaign designed to break enemy morale and encourage surrender. The use of extreme violence against civilians served multiple psychological purposes. First, it created a reputation for brutality that often preceded armies, causing populations to surrender without resistance. Second, extreme violence served as a demonstration of power designed to discourage future resistance. Third, the systematic brutalization of civilians was designed to create lasting trauma that would persist long after military campaigns ended. Medieval armies developed specific techniques for maximizing psychological impact. Public executions were conducted in ways designed to create maximum terror. The display of severed heads, the public rape of prominent women, and the systematic destruction of religious symbols were all calculated to create psychological trauma that would extend far beyond the immediate victims. The systematic plunder of civilian populations was one of the most organized aspects of medieval warfare. Medieval armies developed sophisticated systems for identifying, seizing, and distributing plunder that reveals the extent to which civilian suffering was built into the structure of medieval military operations. Medieval looting operations were carefully planned and executed. Advanced scouts would identify valuable targets, prosperous farms, merchant compounds, and religious institutions. The actual looting process followed established protocols, with soldiers assigned specific roles. Medieval armies had developed techniques for forcing civilians to reveal hidden wealth. Torture was systematically applied to extract information about buried treasure, hidden grain stores, and concealed valuables. The distribution of plunder within medieval armies was carefully regulated, ensuring that every member had a personal financial incentive to participate in the terrorization of civilian populations. Medieval chroniclers describe looting operations that stripped entire regions of all portable wealth. The goal was not just to enrich the conquering army, but to ensure that the conquered population could not quickly recover their ability to support future resistance. Religious institutions occupied a special place in medieval warfare, serving as both symbols of enemy culture and repositories of concentrated wealth. The systematic targeting of monasteries, churches, and religious communities reveals the extent to which medieval warfare was designed to destroy not just military capacity, but cultural identity itself. Monasteries were particularly attractive targets because they typically contained the accumulated wealth of entire regions. These institutions served as banks, storing not just religious treasures but also the valuables that local populations had deposited for safekeeping. The sack of a single monastery could yield more wealth than the plunder of dozens of villages. The destruction of religious institutions served important psychological purposes. In medieval society, religious buildings were considered sacred spaces that provided protection and spiritual comfort to local populations. Their destruction was designed to demonstrate that traditional sources of security and hope were powerless against military force. Medieval armies developed specific techniques for the desecration of religious sites. Altars were deliberately defiled, religious artifacts were destroyed in public ceremonies, and sacred texts were burned in ways designed to maximize psychological impact on local populations. The targeting of religious personnel was particularly brutal. Monks and nuns were often subjected to extreme violence, not just for their potential wealth, but because their suffering was considered particularly effective at breaking community morale. The public torture and execution of religious figures was designed to demonstrate that even the most sacred members of society were vulnerable to military power. The systematic destruction of religious institutions had long-term cultural impacts that extended far beyond the immediate military campaigns. Communities that had lost their religious centers often experienced cultural fragmentation that persisted for generations. Medieval chronicles describe the systematic burning of monastery libraries, destroying centuries of accumulated knowledge and cultural heritage. This destruction was not accidental. It was a deliberate attempt to erase the cultural identity of conquered populations. Children were among the most vulnerable victims of medieval warfare, and their systematic targeting reveals the extent to which medieval armies were willing to inflict long-term damage on enemy populations. The brutalization of children was not a byproduct of warfare. It was a deliberate tactic designed to ensure that enemy communities could not recover quickly from military defeats. Medieval armies targeted children for several strategic reasons. First, children represented the future military and economic potential of enemy populations. By killing or enslaving children, medieval armies could prevent future resistance and ensure long-term population decline in conquered territories. Second, the targeting of children was designed to create maximum psychological trauma in adult populations. Parents who witnessed violence against their children often became completely demoralized, abandoning resistance and accepting any terms offered by conquering armies. Third, children were valuable as slaves and could be sold or traded to generate income for military operations. The systematic enslavement of children was a significant component of the economic model that sustained medieval warfare. Medieval armies developed specific protocols for dealing with captured children. Very young children were often killed immediately because they were considered economic burdens with no immediate value. Older children were evaluated for their potential usefulness as slaves, servants, or sexual victims. The systematic separation of children from their families was used as a method of cultural destruction. Children who were captured and raised by enemy armies often lost their cultural identity and could not contribute to the reconstruction of their original communities. Medieval chronicles describe the systematic killing of children in ways designed to maximize psychological impact on adult populations. Parents were often forced to witness violence against their children, creating trauma that extended far beyond the immediate victims. The targeting of children in medieval warfare reveals the extent to which these conflicts were designed to inflict permanent damage on enemy populations. This wasn't warfare designed to achieve quick political objectives. It was warfare designed to ensure that conquered populations could never recover their ability to resist. The rise of mercenary armies in medieval warfare significantly intensified the brutalization of civilian populations. Unlike feudal levies who fought for their lords and communities, mercenaries were professional soldiers whose livelihood depended on warfare and plunder. This economic relationship created incentives for extreme violence against civilian populations. Mercenary companies were essentially mobile criminal enterprises that sustained themselves through systematic plunder. These organizations developed sophisticated methods for extracting wealth from civilian populations, combining military efficiency with criminal brutality. Mercenary-on-mercenary warfare in Italy led to relatively bloodless campaigns which relied as much on maneuver as on battles. since the condottieri recognized it was more efficient to attack the enemy's ability to wage war rather than his battle forces. However, this strategic approach made civilian populations the primary targets of military operations. Mercenary companies often operated independently of any political authority, making them particularly dangerous to civilian populations. These organizations had no loyalty to local communities and no incentive to preserve civilian lives or property. Their survival depended on continuous plunder and violence. The internal organization of mercenary companies was designed to maximize efficiency in civilian brutalization. These organizations developed specialized roles: scouts who identified valuable targets, negotiators who extracted ransoms, and enforcers who implemented violence against resistant populations. Mercenary companies often remained in conquered territories for extended periods, creating systems of ongoing exploitation that went far beyond traditional military occupation. These organizations would establish protection rackets, forcing civilian populations to pay regular tribute in exchange for avoiding violence. The economic model of mercenary warfare created incentives for extreme violence against civilian populations. Mercenaries were paid through shares of plunder, creating personal financial incentives for every member of the company to participate in civilian brutalization. The international nature of mercenary companies meant that they often had no cultural or linguistic connections to the populations they terrorized. This cultural distance made extreme violence easier to justify and implement. Siege warfare represented perhaps the most systematic and prolonged form of civilian suffering in medieval warfare. Unlike raids or battles, sieges trapped entire populations in confined spaces, where they became subject to months or years of deliberate starvation, disease, and psychological torture. Medieval siege tactics were specifically designed to maximize civilian suffering. The primary goal was not to defeat enemy military forces, but to make conditions inside besieged cities so unbearable that the population would force their leaders to surrender. Starvation was the primary weapon of siege warfare. Medieval armies would surround cities completely, cutting off all food supplies and forcing civilian populations to consume increasingly desperate substitutes for nutrition. Chronicle accounts describe civilian populations eating leather, bark, and eventually resorting to cannibalism. The psychological impact of siege warfare was carefully calculated. Besieging armies would display captured prisoners, where defenders could see them, often torturing and executing them in public view to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Disease was deliberately weaponized in siege warfare. Medieval armies would catapult diseased corpses into besieged cities, spreading plague and other infections among civilian populations. This biological warfare was designed to weaken resistance and create additional psychological pressure. The systematic destruction of water supplies was a standard siege tactic. Wells would be poisoned, aqueducts destroyed, and water sources contaminated to force civilian populations to choose between death from thirst and death from disease. Medieval siege warfare often lasted for months or years, creating prolonged suffering that affected entire generations. Children born during sieges often died from malnutrition or disease, while adults experienced psychological trauma that persisted long after the sieges ended. The economic impact of siege warfare extended far beyond the immediate military campaign. Cities that had endured prolonged sieges often required decades to recover their economic base and population levels. The aftermath. Long-term consequences for civilian populations. The long-term consequences of medieval warfare for civilian populations were far more devastating than the immediate violence. Communities that had experienced medieval warfare often suffered from economic, social, and psychological damage that persisted for generations. The demographic impact of medieval warfare was severe and long-lasting. Early modern warfare in Western Europe exposed civilian populations to violence, hardship, and disease, creating mortality patterns that affected entire regions for decades. Economic recovery from medieval warfare was extremely difficult. The systematic destruction of infrastructure, the killing or displacement of skilled workers, and the seizure of accumulated wealth created economic damage that required generations to repair. The psychological trauma of medieval warfare affected entire communities. Survivors often experienced what modern psychology would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, while entire communities developed cultural patterns based on fear and distrust. The social fabric of communities was permanently altered by medieval warfare. Traditional authority structures were destroyed. family units were broken apart, and social networks were severed. The reconstruction of these social relationships often took decades or never occurred at all. The cultural impact of medieval warfare was profound. Communities that had experienced systematic violence often developed cultures of fear and suspicion that persisted long after the immediate military threats had ended. The political consequences of medieval warfare were equally severe. Communities that had been systematically brutalized often lost their ability to maintain independent political institutions, leading to long-term political fragmentation and instability. The environmental impact of medieval warfare was also significant. The systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure, the poisoning of water sources, and the disruption of farming practices created environmental damage that affected entire regions for extended periods. The normalization of civilian suffering. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval warfare was the extent to which extreme violence against civilian populations became normalized and accepted as a legitimate component of military strategy. This normalization was not accidental. It was the result of systematic cultural and institutional changes that made civilian suffering an expected part of warfare. Medieval military treatises and chronicles discuss the brutalization of civilian populations as routine military operations. These texts reveal that extreme violence against non-combatants was not considered aberrant behavior, but rather an expected and necessary component of effective warfare. The legal systems of medieval societies provided little protection for civilian populations during warfare. The concept of civilian immunity was virtually non-existent, and international law provided no framework for limiting violence against non-combatants. Religious institutions, which might have been expected to provide moral restraint on military violence, often actively encouraged or participated in the brutalization of civilian populations. The concept of holy war and crusade explicitly sanctioned extreme violence against enemy civilians. The economic systems of medieval societies were structured in ways that made civilian suffering profitable. The systematic plunder of civilian populations was not just tolerated. It was financially rewarded and socially celebrated. The cultural values of medieval warrior societies celebrated violence and conquest while devaluing the lives of civilian populations. This cultural framework made extreme violence against non-combatants seem natural and necessary. The normalization of civilian suffering in medieval warfare had profound implications for the development of military culture and international relations. The systematic brutalization of non-combatants became embedded in military traditions that persisted long after the medieval period ended. The systematic brutalization of civilian populations in medieval warfare established patterns of military behavior that influenced the development of warfare for centuries. Understanding this historical legacy is crucial for comprehending the evolution of military ethics and international law. The medieval period established civilian populations as legitimate military targets in ways that continue to influence warfare well into the modern era. The systematic targeting of non-combatants became embedded in military doctrine and remained a standard component of warfare until the development of modern international law. The economic model of medieval warfare, which relied on systematic plunder of civilian populations, established patterns of military financing that persisted for centuries. The expectation that armies would sustain themselves through civilian exploitation remained a standard component of military planning until the development of modern state financing systems. The psychological warfare techniques developed during the medieval period continued to influence military strategy throughout history. The systematic use of terror against civilian populations became a standard component of military doctrine that persisted well into the modern era. The institutional structures that supported civilian brutalization in medieval warfare became embedded in military organizations and remained influential throughout history. The normalization of extreme violence against non-combatants became part of military culture that required centuries to change. The legal and ethical frameworks that emerged from medieval warfare continue to influence international relations and military law throughout history. The lack of protection for civilian populations during warfare remained a standard component of international law until the development of modern humanitarian law. The reality of medieval warfare was far more horrific than popular culture suggests. This was not a period of noble knights and honorable combat, but rather an era of systematic civilian brutalization that stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. The evidence reveals that medieval warfare was primarily a campaign of terror directed against civilian populations. The systematic targeting of non-combatants was not a byproduct of military operations. It was the primary strategic objective of medieval armies. The scale and systematic nature of civilian suffering in medieval warfare demonstrates that these conflicts were designed to inflict maximum long-term damage on enemy populations. This was not warfare designed to achieve quick political objectives, but rather warfare designed to ensure that conquered populations could never recover their ability to resist. The normalization of extreme violence against civilian populations during the medieval period established patterns of military behavior that influenced the development of warfare for centuries. The systematic brutalization of non-combatants became embedded in military culture and remained a standard component of warfare until the development of modern international law. The historical record of medieval warfare serves as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty and the importance of legal and ethical frameworks that protect civilian populations during military conflicts. The civilians who suffered and died during medieval warfare were not statistics. They were individuals with families, dreams, and communities that were systematically destroyed by military forces that viewed their suffering as a necessary component of effective warfare. The true horror of medieval warfare lies not just in its extreme violence, but in its systematic nature and widespread acceptance. This was not random brutality, but rather organized terror that was planned, implemented, and celebrated by the military and political institutions of medieval society. Understanding the reality of medieval warfare is crucial for comprehending the development of modern military ethics and international law. The systematic brutalization of civilian populations during this period serves as a historical foundation for understanding why modern legal frameworks place such emphasis on protecting non-combatants during military conflicts. The victims of medieval warfare deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals whose suffering contributed to the gradual development of more humane approaches to military conflict. Their stories serve as a reminder of the importance of maintaining legal and ethical frameworks that protect civilian populations and the ongoing need to resist the normalization of extreme violence against non-combatants in any era.